Good evening. I'm going to discuss about crucifixion, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Today is the April 12th, 2017. It's a holy week for Christians, so it is apt to talk about crucifixion. And today I'm going to discuss about medical theories on the cause of death in crucifixion, written by Matthew Maslin and Pierce D. Mitchell. Written evidence for the details of crucifixion has been limited to eyewitness accounts and other related written text. No Roman period instructions for those performing crucifixion have been preserved as far as we are aware. The most detailed accounts of any one particular crucifixion are the biblical passages covering the death of Jesus of Nazareth. But we should not assume that this was by any means representative of all crucifixions. Indeed, the precise details may well have varied between regions, evolved over time, or even depending upon the social status of the victim and the crime he allegedly committed. Flavius Josephus, in between 3700 AD, wrote of the hundreds of Jewish prisoners crucified at Jerusalem in 70 CE during an uprising against the Romans. Josephus Flavius writes as follows: They were first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and were crucified before the wall of the city. The soldiers, out of wrath and hatred, they bore the Jews, nailed those they caught to the crosses in different postures by way of jest. Josephus Flavius. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, who lived between 45 to 65 AD, recorded another mass crucifixion and noted, I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with their head down to the ground. Some impale their private parts. Others stretch out their arms. Seneca. In Roman times, a common starting point was to be whipped across the back, buttocks, and legs with the flagrum. This was a short whip with sharp objects interweaved into the thongs. The victim was then often obliged to carry part of their cross to the place of execution outside the city walls. The weight of this would obviously vary depending upon the region and the type of the wood used. Once at the place of crucifixion, the hands and feet of the prisoner were fixed to the cross with either nails or cords, and the cross erected in any one of a range of orientations. If crucified head up, the victim's weight may have also have been supported on a small seat. This was believed to prolong the time it took a man to die. Victims in the head up position could spend several days on the cross before they died. One technique used by the Romans to hasten death was to break the legs below the knee with a blunt instrument. Modern interpretation in the medical literature as to how this might work includes blood loss from the fracture site or respiratory failure from fat embolism. In those positioned head up, then respiratory failure might also ensue as a consequence of the inability to inflate the chest sufficiently, since the legs could no longer be used to support the weight of the body. However, it is unknown which of these three widely stated hypotheses is correct, since crucifixion is not employed as a modern legal method of execution. Analysis of the clinical literature suggests that there has been suboptimal use of these historical sources in post publications. Over 40 such articles have been reviewed for this study, although only a proportion of these have specifically been quoted the reference list as they highlight particular points. The vast majority of articles do not refer to text in the original languages that describe the detail of crucifixion, which are mostly in Latin and Greek. At best, there is occasional reference to a few Roman period texts that have been published in English translation. However, most papers do not even discuss the translations of these texts but chose to quote previous publications by other medical authors for their historical information. In some cases, the result is a series of misquotes that bear limited resemblance to the actual surviving evidence. There has been just one archaeological case of crucifixion published to our knowledge. Cases are rare, as most crucified people were not formally buried but left on a rubbish dump to be eaten by wild dogs and hyenas. The one case we do have was a young Jewish man buried during the Roman period in a tomb near in Israel. The inscription on the ossuary suggests his name was probably Yehohanan ben Hagal. The skeletal remains were only available for study for a week before being given a Jewish burial, although a model of this calcaneus and nail have been exhibited in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The excavated remains were fragmentary and incomplete, but were unmistakably a case of crucifixion. The initial osteoarchaeological interpretation of the remains was of poor quality and somewhat misleading. A much more expert analysis of these remains was published in 1985 by Zias and Sekalas. They described how an 11.5 centimeter iron nail had been hammered through the body of the right calcaneus from lateral to medial and was still in situ. The tip of the nail was bent, suggesting that during its insertion it had perhaps met a hard knot of wood or pre-existing nail left from an earlier crucifixion. The remains of a flat piece of olive wood were found to be located between the lateral aspect of the calcaneus and the head of the nail. Its use may have been to prevent the crucifixion victim freeing his foot by forcing it laterally over the head of the nail. It seems that, at least in this case, the heels were nailed to the sides of the cross. There was no evidence for nail insertion through the bones of the wrist or forearm, although this is widely stated in medical articles. The appearance of the tibial fragments was suggestive of post-mortem damage due to the decomposition process, not ante-mortem fractures to hasten death. However, several medical articles incorrectly state that they were ante-mortem. We also have no idea as to whether this particular victim was positioned head up, head down, or in any other orientation. Every carving of Jesus' crucifixion that we have ever seen in Catholic or Protestant churches have a nail passing through both feet from front to back. This religious stereotype has influenced the views of many researchers over the years. However, there is no evidence that crucifixion was actually carried out in this way in classical times. Over the years, a number of researchers have tried to test both the physiology and the symptomatology of crucifixion. Zugibe has been the most recent and the most thorough with his humane experimental recreation of certain aspects of crucifixion. The volunteers were attached to the cross in a safe and temporary way, were carefully monitored, and the study terminated at the time of their request. The fact that none of the reenactment research has actually crucified people means that these studies have only a limited relevance to genuine cases. The absence of whipping, carrying a heavy cross, being nailed to it, the dehydration from water deprivation and hot sun, and the anxiety of their imminent death might all have resulted in somewhat different findings in the modern groups and crucifixion victims 2000 years ago. Furthermore, reenacted crucifixions have typically placed their volunteers in the head-up position displayed in Christian churches and not in the wide variety of positions recorded in the written records from Roman times. Zugibe attached the hands of his volunteers to a cross with leather gloves. The legs were placed with the knees and hips flexed and with the plantar surface of the feet flush with the anterior aspect of the cross upright. They were attached to the upright using a belt that ran over the dorsum of the feet. The choice of foot position seems to have been influenced by images in churches, but is at odds with the archaeological evidence and to our knowledge is not supported by historical evidence either. Zugibe's aim was to establish the cause of death of Jesus of Nazareth, and he tested many physiological variables in a systematic manner. He concluded the hypovolemic shock caused Jesus' death, and the asphyxiation theory had been overwhelmingly disproved. However, the conclusion was not based on any positive evidence for the shock theory, which was not tested, obviously, but rather upon negative evidence for the asphyxiation theory. It seems that none of the volunteers suffered significant difficulty breathing while on the replica cross. However, the longest time any were left on the cross seems to have been limited on account of the physical discomfort of being on the cross. Since it was extremely rare for anyone in Roman times to die on a cross within the first few hours, it could be argued that the time scale of the study cannot disprove asphyxiation theory. Furthermore, much of Zugibe's arguments are based on evidence from the Turin shroud. This appears to be a medieval forgery dating from between 1260 and 1390 AD, since fibers have been radiocarbon dated by 3 separate laboratories. While some claim that the carbon date merely reflects the date of a medieval repair to the material, we would argue that there is still no firm evidence to suggest that the Shroud of Turin can be used as part of an impartial scientific study. So anyway, this is the medical research on the crucifixion. And we know that crucifixion was one of the grisliest model of execution. And Jesus suffered. Jesus paid his blood, every drop is blood, for the sake of humanity. So the pain and suffering of being on a cross, that is the focus of this week meditation for all Christians. So let us reflect on the pain and suffering of Jesus on the cross. Thank you.